The night air holds a particular stillness, and in this quietness there exists a world preserved in ink and wood, a world where mountains rise in graduated shades of blue, where waves curl with geometric precision, where cherry blossoms drift across paper skies that have remained unchanged for centuries. I find myself drawn tonight into the realm of Japanese woodblock prints, those remarkable images created through patience and collaboration, through the careful carving of wooden blocks and the deliberate application of color, layer upon patient layer, until an image emerges that seems both impossibly simple and infinitely complex. These prints exist in a space between art and craft, between the singular vision of an artist and the collective skill of many hands. And tonight, as thoughts begin to drift like pigment dispersing in water, I am tracing the journey of how these images came to be, how they evolved over centuries, and how they captured moments of beauty with such clarity that they still speak across the span of time. There is something about the process itself that invites contemplation, the way a design must be conceived in reverse, the way each color requires its own block, its own moment of pressure and release, the way registration marks ensure that each layer aligns perfectly with the last, creating images through accumulation, through the steady building of hues and lines until a complete world materializes on mulberry paper. The prints themselves often depict simple scenes, a courtesan pausing in a doorway, a fisherman bracing against the spray, an actor frozen in a moment of theatrical intensity. Yet within these seemingly straightforward images lie depths of technical mastery and aesthetic philosophy that reveal themselves slowly, like details emerging from morning mist. Tonight the focus settles on the grain of cherry wood, seasoned and cut along the plank, its surface waiting to receive the artist's design, and I imagine the transfer of that design, brushed onto thin paper, laid face down against the wood, then rubbed away until only the lines remain, embedded in the surface, ready to guide the carver's tools. The carver works with blades of different sizes, some broad, some fine as needles, each cut made with consideration, removing what must be removed, leaving raised what will receive the ink, creating a topography of image and absence, and this carved surface becomes a kind of archive, a physical record of artistic intention that can be inked and pressed again and again, each impression a ghost of the original, yet somehow complete unto itself. Water-based inks pool in shallow dishes, each color mixed to precise specifications, and the printer applies these inks with brushes made from bamboo, sheathed in hemp fiber. The dampened paper receives each layer, absorbing pigment into its fibers, and between each printing there is waiting, allowing one color to set before the next is applied, a rhythm of action and patience that stretches across days. These prints were never meant to be rare. They were created in editions, sometimes hundreds of impressions from a single set of blocks, meant for townspeople and merchants, for those who could not afford painted scrolls, but who hungered for beauty nonetheless. And yet this very accessibility, this democratic distribution of art, became part of their enduring power. The subjects they chose tell stories of a floating world, ukiyo, a concept that speaks to the transient nature of pleasure, of beauty, of life itself. And in capturing these fleeting moments, the printmakers created something paradoxical. They made the ephemeral permanent. They froze the flowing world in blocks of cherry wood and layers of mineral pigment. As I consider these images tonight, I see them not just as pictures, but as windows into a particular way of seeing, a cultural perspective that found profound beauty in the everyday, in the curve of a courtesan's neck, in the pattern of rain against a bridge, in the startled expression of a kabuki performer, and this attention to the momentary, to the specific and small, creates an intimacy across centuries. The light from a paper lantern, the fold of a kimono, the distant outline of a Mount Fuji. These elements repeat across thousands of prints, familiar motifs that anchor the viewer in a recognizable world. Yet each artist brought their own vision, their own innovations of composition and color, their own understanding of how to balance negative space with intricate detail. And so tonight, as thoughts begin to settle into the slower rhythms of contemplation, I am entering this world of woodblock prints, not as a distant observer, but as someone tracing the evolution of a tradition, following the path from its earliest influences through centuries of refinement, watching as techniques developed and styles shifted, as masters emerged and left their indelible marks, as an entire visual language came into being, one careful impression at a time. The story begins long before the islands of Japan developed their own distinctive printing tradition. It begins across the sea in China, where the art of woodblock printing emerged more than 1,000 years ago, during the Tang Dynasty, when Buddhist monks sought ways to reproduce sacred texts and images, to spread teachings across vast distance. And they discovered that carved wooden blocks, inked and pressed against paper, could create identical copies, each one a perfect echo of the original. These early Chinese prints were primarily textual, sutras, and religious documents, though images of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas also appeared, radiating calm from their wooden matrices, and the technology traveled along trade routes, moving through Korea, carried by monks and merchants until it reached Japan sometime in the 8th century, arriving with Buddhism itself, inseparable from the faith it served. The earliest Japanese woodblock prints were called suramono, small devotional images, and hyakumanto durani, tiny printed prayers inserted into miniature wooden pagodas, created under the patronage of Empress Shotoku around 764. These were not art in the sense we might understand it. They were spiritual technology, tools for generating merit, for multiplying prayers through reproduction. And yet they established the fundamental technique, the marriage of wood and ink and paper that would eventually give birth to something entirely new. For centuries, so printing in Japan remained primarily in service of religion and scholarship. Buddhist temples produced illustrated sutras. Confucian texts were reproduced for study, and the technique refined itself slowly through generations of anonymous craftsmen who learned the resistance of different woods, the behavior of various inks, the proper dampness of paper, knowledge accumulated grain by grain, like sediment settling into strata. The political landscape of Japan during these early centuries shaped what could be printed and who could print it. The country existed under strict feudal control, with power concentrated in the hands of the shogunate and regional lords, the daimyo, and the vast majority of people lived in agricultural villages bound to the land, with little access to literacy or luxury. The world of printing remained confined to temples and the estates of nobility, removed from common life. But beneath this rigid surface, currents were shifting. By the early 1600s, Japan had endured more than a century of civil war, the Sengoku period, the age of warring states, and when Tokugawa Ieyasu finally unified the country in 1603, establishing the Tokugawa shogunate, he created conditions that would inadvertently nurture a remarkable flowering of urban culture. The Tokugawa regime implemented a policy of national isolation, sakoku, closing Japan's borders to nearly all foreign contact, permitting only limited trade through the port of Nagasaki. And this inward turn, this centuries-long pause in external engagement, created a kind of cultural greenhouse where Japanese arts developed according to their own internal logic, evolving forms that owed little to continental influence, that spoke in distinctly Japanese visual vocabularies. Within this closed system, cities began to grow. Edo, which would later become Tokyo, swelled into one of the largest cities in the world, with a population approaching 1 million by the early 1700s. And alongside it, Osaka and Kyoto thrived as centers of commerce and culture. And within these urban spaces, a new social class emerged, the chonin, the townspeople, merchants and artisans who, despite their low rank in the official Confucian hierarchy, possessed wealth and leisure and hunger for entertainment. These urban populations created demand for what would become known as ukiyo-shu, pictures of the floating world, a term that captured something essential about the philosophy of these new city dwellers. The Buddhist concept of ukiyo originally meant the sorrowful world of suffering and rebirth, but the townspeople repurposed it, transforming its meaning into something more hedonistic. The floating world became the realm of pleasure, of theaters and tea houses, of beautiful courtesans and famous actors, of transient delights to be savored before they vanished like morning dew. The earliest ukiyo-e were paintings, single works created by artists like Hishikawa Moronobu, who worked in the late 1600s. His paintings depicted the pleasure quarters of Edo, the Yoshiwara district, where courtesans moved through carefully choreographed rituals of seduction and display, and his compositions showed these women in moments of elegant repose, their kimonos decorated with intricate patterns, their hair arranged in elaborate styles that required hours to construct and identified their rank and house at a glance. Moronobu understood that demand existed for these images beyond the wealthy few who could commission paintings, and he began producing woodblock prints, initially simple works in black ink only, called sumizuri. These prints depicted the same subjects as his paintings: courtesans and kabuki actors, scenes from the pleasure quarters, but they were affordable, accessible to shop clerks and artisans, to anyone with a few coins who wanted to bring beauty into their modest homes. These early prints were crude by later standards, single-color impressions with broad lines and minimal detail, but they established the genres that would dominate ukiyo-e for the next 2 centuries: bijinga, pictures of beautiful women, and yakusha-e, prints of kabuki actors, both subjects drawn from the licensed pleasure quarters, the only spaces in rigid Tokugawa society where a degree of freedom and fantasy could flourish. The process of creating these prints required collaboration. The artist designed the image, creating a master drawing, but then the work passed to the carver, the horishi, who transferred the design to wood, typically cherry, and carved away the negative space, leaving raised lines that would receive ink, and finally to the printer, the Surishi, who applied ink to the block and pressed paper against it, using a flat tool called a baran, rubbing in circular motions to transfer the image, each impression requiring judgment and skill to achieve the proper density and clarity. For decades, these prints remained monochromatic, though sometimes color was added by hand after printing, brushed onto individual impressions, a painstaking process that limited production, but the desire for color, for images that could capture the brilliance of kimono fabrics and the flush of cosmetics, drove technical innovation, and printmakers experimented with ways to introduce color through the printing process itself. The breakthrough came gradually, first with tani prints, where red lead pigment was applied by hand to black impressions, then with Benazuri prints using 2 or 3 blocks to add colors, typically pink and green, to the basic black key block impression. These were registered using marks called kento, small notches cut into the corner and edge of each block, against which the paper was positioned to ensure each color layer aligned precisely with the others. By the 1730s and 40s, artists like Okumura Masanobu were producing increasingly sophisticated benizuri, images where color began to play a structural role, defining space and creating atmosphere, not merely decorating a black outline, and the prints grew larger, more ambitious in composition, incorporating perspective techniques borrowed from Western art, though filtered through Japanese aesthetic sensibilities, creating hybrid spaces that felt both familiar and strange. The collaborative nature of print production meant that innovation could come from any point in the process. A carver might discover a new way to suggest texture. A printer might experiment with gradation, blending colors on a single block to create effects called bokashi, where pigment shifted from dark to light across a passage of sky or water. And publishers, the Hanmoto, who financed production and coordinated between artists and craftsmen, played crucial roles in pushing technical boundaries, seeking competitive advantages in an increasingly crowded marketplace. These publishers operated from shops clustered in specific districts of Edo. They maintained stables of artists and relationships with skilled carvers and printers. They tracked popular trends, knowing when actor prints would sell and when landscape scenes might find favor, and they navigated the censorship regulations imposed by the shogunate, which periodically cracked down on images deemed too luxurious or morally corrupting, requiring publishers to submit prints for approval, receiving seals that permitted sale. The world captured in these early prints feels both distant and immediate. Courtesans pose in rooms with tatami mats and sliding shoji screens. Their robes cascade in complex folds that demonstrate the artist's skill at rendering textile patterns. Kabuki actors freeze mid-gesture, their faces painted in the distinctive kumadori style. Bold patterns of red and blue that identified character types, heroes and villains, ghosts and demons, and behind these figures, minimal backgrounds suggest interior spaces or garden views, just enough context to anchor the scene without competing with the main subject. What's remarkable about these early prints is their essential restraint. Even as technical capabilities increased, the aesthetic remained fundamentally about economy of means, about suggesting depth with a few carefully placed lines, about using negative space as actively as marked areas. And this restraint wasn't limitation. It was philosophy, an understanding that emptiness held power, that what was left unsaid could resonate as strongly as what was depicted. The transformation arrived in the year 1765, when a publisher named Harunobu Suzuki, working with carvers and printers whose names have been lost, produced the first true Nishiki-e brocade pictures, prints that used multiple blocks to achieve full color, sometimes 10 or more separate impressions layered onto a single sheet, each color requiring its own carved block, its own moment of careful registration, and suddenly the floating world bloomed into vivid life. These new full-color prints revolutionized what was possible. Courtesans could now be shown in kimono that captured the actual complexity of fabric design, patterns within patterns, flowers scattered across fields of color that themselves contained subtle variations, and the pigments available to printers expanded dramatically. Crushed minerals provided blues and greens, organic sources yielded yellows and pinks, and from Prussia came a synthetic blue, Prussian blue, Bero AI, that would transform Japanese printing with its intensity and permanence, a color so vibrant it seemed to pulse with internal light. The process of creating these multi-block prints required extraordinary coordination. The artist, now often a celebrated figure whose name appeared on the print, would create the initial design in black ink. This drawing went to the carver, who pasted it face down onto a block of cherry wood, carefully rubbing away the paper until only the lines remained, embedded in the wood grain, and then began the painstaking work of cutting away everything that should not print, using blades of varying widths, some broad as fingernails, others fine as thorns. For each color in the design, a separate block had to be carved, and the carver worked from color-separated guides provided by the artist. Knowing that the pink of a kimono lining would require one block, the pattern overlaying it another, the face and hands yet another, building up the image through stratified absence, through carefully orchestrated voids that would receive pigment, and the registration marks, the kento, had to be cut with absolute precision, because even a slight misalignment would cause colors to blur beyond their boundaries, destroying the crispness that defined the medium. Once carved, the blocks passed to the printer, and here the deepest mysteries of the craft resided, because the printer worked not from strict formulas, but from feeling, from understanding how dampness affected paper, how humidity changed ink behavior, how pressure and rubbing patterns could coax different effects from the same block. The printer would dampen sheets of paper, usually made from inner bark of mulberry trees, kozo, beaten into pulp and formed into sheets with a subtle grain that affected how pigment absorbed. The inks themselves were water-based, mixed fresh for each printing session, pigments ground and combined with rice paste to create the proper consistency. Too thick and the color would sit on the paper surface, cracking as it dried. Too thin and it would bleed beyond the carved lines, losing definition, and the printer had to judge this by eye, by experience, adjusting ratios to account for temperature, for the particular character of each batch of paper, for the depth of carving on each block. Application of ink happened with wide, flat brushes, the printer working quickly before the ink could dry on the block, spreading color in smooth strokes that filled the raised surfaces. And then the dampened paper was positioned against the kento marks, laid down onto the inked block with a whisper of contact, and the printer would take up the baron, that flat disc wrapped in bamboo sheath, and begin rubbing, applying pressure in circular patterns that transferred ink from wood to paper, learning through touch when enough pressure had been applied, when the image had fully released from the block. For a print with 10 colors, this process repeated 10 times, each impression requiring fresh ink, fresh positioning, fresh judgment about pressure and timing, and between colors, the paper had to dry, sometimes for hours, before the next layer could be added, and throughout, the printer had to maintain consistent dampness in the paper stock, because paper that dried too much would shrink, throwing off registration, while paper too wet would distort, stretching in unpredictable ways. The colors built upon each other in carefully planned sequences, typically the key block, the one carrying the black outline, printed first, establishing the structure upon which other hues would layer, and then lighter colors before darker, backgrounds before foreground details, each choice affecting what came after, because unlike Western painting, where colors could be mixed and adjusted on a palette, here each hue existed in isolation, achieving optical effects through transparency and overlay rather than physical blending. Certain techniques became signatures of master printers, bokashi, the gradation from dark to light within a single printing, achieved by wiping pigment partially away from the block, or by applying different intensities to different areas, created skies that shifted from deep blue at the zenith to pale pink at the horizon, or water that darkened toward the depths. These gradations required such skill that only the finest printers could execute them consistently, and their work commanded premium prices from publishers who understood that technical excellence attracted buyers. The subjects of these prints expanded as the medium matured, alongside courtesans and actors. Artists began depicting scenes from classical literature, moments from the tale of Genji or the tales of Ise, warriors from historical epics, cherry blossom viewing parties, snow scenes, depictions of famous places, Meisho, the 8 views of Omi, the 53 stations of the Tokaido Road, and each genre developed its own conventions, its own visual language that viewers learned to read. In Bijinga, the prints of beautiful women, artists like Kitagawa Utamaro emerged in the 1780s and 90s, bringing unprecedented psychological depth to his portraits. His women were not mere decorative objects. Their faces showed complex emotions, melancholy, amusement, calculation, captured in the subtle turn of an eye or the slight purse of lips, and he developed the okubi-e format, large head pictures that filled the frame with the courtesan's face and upper body, allowing intimate examination of expression and ornament. Utamaro understood how to use themika, kira, that was sometimes dusted onto backgrounds, creating subtle sparkle that suggested luxury, and how to employ embossing, karazuri, where the block pressed into paper without ink, creating raised patterns that caught light, dimensional effects that added tactile richness, and his color choices spoke to sophisticated understanding of a harmony and contrast, placing brilliant red against muted purple, electric blue against soft gray, combinations that shouldn't work but somehow sang together. The Hokusai actor prints captured kabuki performers in their most famous roles, and these prints functioned almost like modern publicity stills, commemorating performances, allowing fans to take home memories of theatrical experiences. Artists like Toshusai Sharaku, who worked briefly in 1794 and 95, created portraits of actors that bordered on caricature, emphasizing distinctive features, crossed eyes, jutting jaws, expressions of exaggerated emotion that captured the essence of kabuki's stylized performance. His prints were so bold, so uncompromising in their characterization, that they allegedly offended some subjects, and his career ended almost as soon as it began, leaving behind only a handful of months' worth of work, but work so distinctive it remains instantly recognizable. Within the pleasure quarters themselves, the Yoshiwara district of Edo, prints served as advertisements and souvenirs. Courtesans were ranked in elaborate hierarchies, from the highest-ranking oiran, who paraded in magnificent robes, their hair adorned with ornaments worth small fortunes, down through various grades to common prostitutes, and bijinga often identified specific women by name, functioning as a kind of a visual directory for potential clients, though the images idealized their subjects, transforming even ordinary features into perfect oval faces with tiny mouths and gracefully elongated necks. The economics of print production created interesting dynamics because blocks could be used for multiple print runs. Popular images might be reprinted many times over years, and early impressions, pulled when the blocks were sharp and the carving crisp, showed details that later impressions lost as the wood wore down. Collectors learned to distinguish first editions from later printings by these subtle degradations, by the clarity of fine lines or the crispness of text characters, and some prints were so popular that blocks wore out entirely, requiring recarving that never quite matched the original precision. Publishers sometimes issued prints in series, sets of images united by theme, the most famous beauties of the day, the 7 gods of good fortune, acts of the Chushingura revenge story, and these series created ongoing demand, collectors wanting to acquire complete sets, returning month after month to purchase new releases, and the publishers cultivated this market, announcing upcoming designs, building anticipation, operating with commercial savvy that rivaled any modern entertainment industry. Censorship shaped what could be depicted. The Tokugawa shogunate periodically issued sumptuary laws. Attempting to restrict displays of luxury, they felt promoted moral decay. Prints showing courtesans in elaborate kimono might be banned, forcing artists to simplify dress or shift to different subjects temporarily, and political content was strictly forbidden. No criticism of authorities, no commentary on current events, which pushed artistic energy toward historical subjects, nature scenes, no mythological themes, anywhere, meaning could be embedded symbolically rather than stated directly. Yet within these restrictions, creativity flourished. Artists developed visual codes, ways of suggesting what couldn't be shown explicitly. Certain flowers indicated seasons. Certain colors implied emotional states. Compositions referenced classical poetry without including text, and knowledgeable viewers could read these layers of meaning, appreciating both the surface beauty and the deeper resonances. The way a print of plovers flying over waves might echo a poem about lovers separated by circumstance, its meaning enriched by literary association. The physical qualities of the paper itself contributed to the aesthetic. Kozo paper had a slight texture, a warmth that Western papers lacked, and it absorbed ink differently, creating soft edges rather than hard boundaries. Colors seemed to float just beneath the surface rather than sitting on top, and this quality, this slight diffusion, gave prints their characteristic softness, even when depicting dramatic subjects, battles or ghosts. There remained an underlying gentleness, a quality of the handmade that resisted mechanical precision. The 19th century arrived with changes rippling through Japanese society. Though the country remained officially closed to the world, pressures were building, both internal and external, and these tensions would eventually transform not just the political landscape, but the very nature of ukiyo-e itself, pushing the medium in directions its early practitioners could never have imagined. Within the closed system of Tokugawa Japan, economic changes were shifting power. Merchants grew wealthy while samurai, forbidden from engaging in commerce, struggled with fixed stipends that bought less each year. And this merchant class, the chonin, became ever more important patrons of the arts, their tastes shaping what publishers produced, and they demanded novelty, innovation, images that could surprise and delight even jaded urban sensibilities. Artists responded by exploring new subjects. Katsushika Hokusai, born in 1760, began his career producing conventional actor prints and illustrations, but as he matured, his interests expanded to encompass nearly everything. He drew manga, sketchbooks filled with observations of daily life, people working and playing, animals in motion, ghosts and demons, instructional diagrams showing perspective and composition. His curiosity seemed limitless, his hand able to capture anything his eye observed. In the late 1820s, when Hokusai was already in his 70s, he began work on his most famous series, 36 Views of Mount Fuji. Though the series ultimately included 46 prints, and these images transformed landscape from mere background into primary subject, Fuji appeared from countless vantages, seen from Edo, from villages along the Tokaido Road, from tea houses and rice fields and forest clearings, sometimes dominating the composition, sometimes barely visible on a distant horizon, but always present, that perfect cone anchoring the Japanese landscape, both literal mountain and spiritual symbol. The most famous print from this series, The Great Wave off Kanagawa, shows Fuji tiny and distant, barely visible beyond an enormous wave that fills the foreground. The wave curves into a claw shape, foam flying from its crest like snow, and 3 fishing boats ride the trough, their crews hunched low, about to be engulfed. The composition creates extraordinary tension between the transient violence of the wave and the eternal stillness of Fuji, between human vulnerability and natural power, and that Prussian blue imported from the West gives the water an intensity that seems almost supernatural. Hokusai's landscapes introduced compositional innovations. He used Western perspective in ways that felt natural rather than forced, creating depth through overlapping forms and atmospheric effects. Distant mountains fading to pale blue, and he wasn't afraid of bold compositions, placing horizons very high or very low, cropping elements at the frame edge, creating dynamic asymmetries that energized static scenes. A bridge cutting diagonally across the image, tree branches entering from one corner, compositional risks that paid off in prints that felt alive, that drew the eye into continuous exploration. His contemporary, Utagawa Hiroshige, took landscape in different directions, where Hokusai's views felt monumental. Hiroshige's were intimate, suffused with atmosphere and mood. His series 100 Famous Views of Edo, begun in 1856, captured the city through seasons, weather, times of day, showing famous temples and bridges and gardens, but also humble neighborhoods, ferries crossing rivers, views from tea houses, snow falling on bamboo groves, rain streaking across the sky, and fine parallel lines that demonstrated astonishing carving precision. Hiroshige mastered the depiction of weather. His rain prints show precipitation as lines of varying density, some vertical, some wind-blown, creating curtains of water that obscure and reveal, and his snow scenes capture that peculiar silence that comes with snowfall, flakes rendered as white spots against darker grounds, accumulating on bare branches and temple roofs, the prints somehow conveying not just the look of snow, but the muffled quiet it brings, the way it transforms familiar landscapes into something strange and beautiful. Both artists benefited from advances in printing technology, more sophisticated color gradations, finer carving that could render detail approaching the limits of human vision, and both worked with master printers who understood their artistic intentions, who could translate a sketched indication into a perfect bokashi that captured the exact quality of dawn light or evening mist, the collaboration between artist and craftsman reaching heights of integration where individual contributions became indistinguishable from the unified whole. Yet even as landscape prints flourished, other genres continued. Warrior prints, mushae, depicted famous battles and legendary heroes, samurai facing down demons or confronting human enemies. These prints often showed violence explicitly, severed heads, spurting blood, the gore rendered in the same careful technique used for cherry blossoms, creating disturbing beauty, and they satisfied audiences hungry for excitement, for narratives of courage and revenge that reflected samurai values even as actual samurai power waned. Ghost stories and supernatural subjects, kaiden, formed another popular genre. Artists like Utagawa Kuniyoshi created prints showing vengeful spirits, transformed foxes, monsters from folklore, and these images deployed the full technical arsenal of ukiyo-e, using embossing for spirit robes that seemed to float off the paper, mica backgrounds that glittered like otherworldly realms, color combinations that created unnatural, unsettling effects, purples and greens that no natural light produces, and the finest of these prints managed to be both beautiful and genuinely eerie, maintaining aesthetic refinement while depicting subjects designed to frighten. The middle decades of the 19th century brought increasing contact with the outside world. In 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry arrived with his black ships, demanding Japan open to trade, and the centuries of isolation were ending. Within 15 years, the Tokugawa shogunate would collapse. The emperor would be restored to power in the Meiji Restoration of 1868, and Japan would begin a rapid modernization, attempting to match Western military and industrial power. These changes affected ukiyo-e profoundly. New subjects appeared, foreigners in their strange clothing, steam trains, and telegraph lines, Western-style buildings rising in Yokohama and Tokyo. Artists documented the transformation even as they participated in it, creating Yokohama-e pictures of the foreign settlement, showing bearded Westerners in top hats, women in elaborate Victorian dresses, technologies that seemed magical, everything new and strange captured in traditional woodblock technique, the old medium recording its own displacement. Photography arrived, and suddenly the documentary function of prints, their role in recording famous places and beautiful faces, could be fulfilled by mechanical means. And Western printing technology, lithography, and then photomechanical reproduction offered cheaper alternatives for mass-produced images. The economic foundation of ukiyo-e began to erode. Publishers who had thrived for generations found their markets shrinking. Carvers and printers, masters of techniques that took decades to perfect, discovered their skills becoming obsolete. Some artists adapted, creating prints for export, knowing that Western collectors were developing fascination with Japanese art. These export prints sometimes emphasized exoticism, showing geisha and samurai in ways that matched Western fantasies rather than Japanese realities, and they used brighter colors, more saturated pigments, because Western audiences expected boldness, lacking the subtle appreciation for muted tones that Japanese connoisseurs valued. The medium began splitting. Prints made for domestic audiences following different aesthetics than those made for foreign markets. The traditional publisher system weakened. Some artists began self-publishing, controlling their own production, while others worked directly with Western dealers, bypassing Japanese intermediaries entirely, and the collaborative process that had been ukiyo-e's strength became harder to maintain. Master carvers retired without apprentices to replace them. Printers closed their workshops. The accumulated knowledge of centuries began to scatter, preserved only in the blocks and prints themselves, physical records of techniques that were no longer being practiced. Yet even as commercial ukiyo-e declined, the prints themselves were beginning a different journey. They were flowing out of Japan, carried by traders and tourists, finding their way into Western collections, and there they would catalyze artistic revolutions. Impressionists and post-impressionists saw in these prints radical alternatives to Western perspective and composition, the flat planes of color, the bold outlines, the willingness to crop and fragment. Artists like Van Gogh and Monet collected ukiyo-e, studied them, incorporated their lessons into paintings that would transform European art. This influence became known as Japonism, a vogue for all things Japanese that swept through Europe and America in the late 1800s, and it created feedback loops. Western artists inspired by Japanese prints, creating works that then influenced Japanese artists who were themselves trying to modernize. Traditions crossing and recrossing the Pacific, transforming in transit, each culture seeing in the other possibilities for renewal. By the early 20th century, commercial ukiyo-e had essentially ended. The last traditional publishers closed. The great carvers and printers died, their skills largely unrecorded. But something new was emerging, the Shinhanga movement, new prints, which attempted to revive woodblock printing as fine art rather than a commercial product. Artists like Hasui Kawase created landscapes that honored Hiroshige's tradition while incorporating modern sensibilities, softer colors, more atmosphere, scenes of a Japan rapidly disappearing under industrialization, nostalgic visions of villages and temples that modernization was erasing. And alongside Shinhanga came Sosaku Hanga, creative prints, where artists rejected the collaborative model entirely. designing, carving, and printing their own works, treating woodblock as a medium for personal artistic expression rather than commercial reproduction. These prints often showed Western influence, more abstract compositions, experimental use of color, and they moved woodblock printing into conversation with international modernism, transforming a tradition that had been distinctly Japanese into something that could speak across cultures. The old blocks, those that survived, were sometimes preserved in publisher archives or temple collections. Cherry wood carved 2 or 3 centuries earlier, still holding the ghosts of images. Some could still be printed, yielding impressions that connected directly to Edo period hands. Though the paper was different now, the pigments chemically manufactured rather than ground from minerals, and these late impressions lacked some quality of the original that couldn't quite be recaptured, like trying to restart a conversation after decades of silence. What remains now in museums and private collections scattered across the world are these sheets of paper, some faded by light, some preserved in darkness, each one a moment crystallized, a collaboration between artist and carver and printer, between vision and skill and chance. And when I consider them, these images created through such patient accumulation, I find myself drawn not just to what they show, but to what they reveal about the nature of making itself, because there is something profound in the woodblock process, in the way it requires letting go. The artist creates a design but cannot complete it alone, must trust the carver to interpret lines, the printer to choose pressures and hues, and this surrender of control, this necessary collaboration, creates images that belong to no single hand, that emerge from conversation, from the friction and harmony of different skills meeting. And perhaps this is why the prints feel so balanced, so complete, because they contain multiple perspectives, multiple kinds of knowledge, working toward unified expression, the reversal required by the medium, the way designs must be conceived in mirror image, the way carving removes material to create presence. These inversions suggest deeper truths about how meaning emerges, through absence as much as presence, through what is withheld as much as what is shown. The empty spaces in ukiyo-e compositions aren't merely background. They're active participants, creating tension, allowing breath, giving the eye places to rest before returning to detailed passages. And the ephemeral made permanent, this paradox sits at the heart of ukiyo-e philosophy. The floating world was by definition transient, pleasures that couldn't last, beauty that would fade. Courtesans aged, actors died, cherry blossoms scattered after a week, and yet the prince froze these moments, preserved them in wood and ink, created permanence from impermanence, and in doing so revealed something about human desire, our need to hold on to what we know we cannot keep, to create records of what passes, to say this was beautiful and it mattered even though it's gone. The layers of color building toward completion mirror, layers of meaning building toward understanding, each impression adding depth, each hue contributing to an effect that none could create alone. And a viewer standing before these prints sees not just the final image, but, if they look carefully, can trace the process, can see where one color overlaps another, where registration shifted slightly, where the printer's baron created subtle variations in ink density. The work reveals its own making, wears its process as part of its beauty. There's a quality in the finest ukiyo-e that resists description, a rightness of proportion, a harmony of elements that feels inevitable, as if the composition couldn't be any other way. And yet we know from preliminary drawings and variant printings that many choices went into creating this sense of inevitability, that what feels effortless required enormous effort, and this concealment of labor, this appearance of ease, represents its own kind of mastery, the ability to make difficulty disappear into grace. The way rain is depicted as parallel lines carved with such precision that they seem to fall, or snow rendered as negative space. White flakes that exist only as absence of ink. These technical solutions become poetic statements about how we perceive weather, about the relationship between mark and meaning, about how minimal information can trigger complete recognition, the mind filling in what the hand merely suggests, completing the image through its own understanding of rain, of snow, of how light falls on water, and Mount Fuji appearing again and again from countless angles in all seasons becomes more than a mountain, becomes an anchor point, a constant in a floating world, the eternal amid the transient. And each view adds to understanding, each perspective reveals another facet, until Fuji exists, not as a single place, but as an idea, a presence that structures the landscape, that gives meaning through its persistent visibility, its refusal to change while everything around it transforms. The courtesans, frozen in their elaborate robes, their faces showing those complex expressions Utamaro captured so well, they too transcend their immediate subject. They become meditations on performance, on the construction of beauty, on the gap between surface and depth, because these women were playing roles, constructing personas that we clients desired. And the prints show both the construction and something underneath, a weariness, perhaps, or calculation, or genuine feeling breaking through professional composure. And this complexity, this refusal to reduce subjects to simple categories, elevates bijinga beyond mere decoration into something approaching portraiture, recognition of full humanity. The blocks themselves, those that survive, carry their own poetry. Wood grain still visible, centuries of aging having darkened the cherry, and the carved surfaces show where, edges slightly rounded where hundreds or thousands of printings have rubbed ink across the same grooves. And to touch these blocks, to run fingers over carved lines that guided pigment onto paper generations ago, creates uncanny connection. The same physical object that the original printer handled, the same resistance and give, wood that remembers through its own substance the hands that worked it. Collections of prints reveal patterns, certain compositions appearing with variations, artists quoting other artists, publishers reusing successful formulas. And these repetitions aren't failures of imagination, but part of the tradition. Viewers enjoyed recognizing familiar elements. Courtesans shown from three-quarter view became a convention, allowing display of profile and front simultaneously. And within these conventions, artists found room for infinite variation. The angle of a head, the choice of background color, the particular pattern on a kimono, each decision contributing to originality within tradition, innovation that honors rather than rejects what came before. The colors themselves have changed over time, fugitive pigments fading, blues that were once vibrant, now pale, reds that once blazed, now soft, and this fading creates accidental beauty, palettes that no artist intended, but that time has curated, and early impressions preserved away from light show what was lost, those electric Prussian blues, those sharp crimson aniline dyes, and the contrast reveals how much our experience of these prints is mediated by their age. We see them through the filter of their survival. Beauty transformed by time into different beauty in quiet moments. Looking at these prints, I find myself aware of all the hands involved: the artist's hand drawing, the carver's hand cutting, the printer's hand rubbing, the collector's hand preserving, the curator's hand displaying, and my own hand holding a catalog or my eyes tracing a screen. All of us connected through these images, across centuries, across cultures, touching something that refuses to die despite every reason it should have vanished with the world that created it. And perhaps that's what remains most powerful, that these prints depicting a floating world have themselves floated free of their context. They no longer need the pleasure quarters or kabuki theaters to make sense. They've become simply beautiful, simply accomplished, simply moving in ways that transcend their original purposes. And this transformation from commercial product to fine art, from local to universal, from timely to timeless, completes their journey, fulfills something the original makers might not have imagined, but somehow prepared for by making them well, by bringing skill and care to work that could have been merely adequate. The night deepens around these thoughts, and the prints remain in their museums and collections, waiting for eyes to find them, for minds to engage with their quiet complexity, each viewing a kind of reprinting, an impression pulled from the original across the gap of time. And the collaboration continues between long-dead makers and living viewers, between wood and paper and light and attention, creating meaning anew with each encounter, the floating world floating still, held in suspension, beautiful and transient and somehow enduring, like memory itself, like all things we try to preserve against forgetting. The images fade into darkness now, courtesans returning to their houses, actors leaving the stage, Fuji disappearing into night, waves settling back into the sea. And what remains is impression, after image, the ghost of beauty on the eye, layers of color settling into something that might be rest, the baron's circular motion slowing, coming to stillness, all the marks made, all the cuts taken, all the colors applied, and the work complete, waiting in its silence, holding its stories, patient as cherrywood, soft as mulberry paper, permanent as anything can be in this floating world, where nothing lasts and everything remains, in the space between the carved and the printed, between the intended and the achieved, where all art lives in the gentle territory of almost and enough and done.